from Sinai, and that he passed it down, and the different ways that we could legislate based on the information that's taught to us. But that's all with the assumption that it comes from Sinai. But how do we know that it's actually true? And could we give actual evidence for Sinai? And that's going to be today's discussion. We're going to begin with a short video. One second, hold on. Sorry about that. Okay. One second. Sorry, bear with me one more minute. Okay, here we go. And here's the video.
Have you ever wondered, if polygamy is forbidden in Jewish law, why did some of our biblical ancestors have more than one wife? For example, our forefather Jacob had 4 wives, while King David is said to have had 6. When the Jewish people received the Torah, they received instructions pertaining to all areas of life, including marriage. The Torah did not, however, forbid polygamy. The prohibition against a man having more than one wife is a relatively recent innovation in Jewish law. Who enacted this law, and why? Rabbeinu Gershom ben Yehuda was the spiritual leader of the Ashkenazi Jewish community at the beginning of the 11th century. Around the year 1000, he convened an assembly of leading rabbis who issued various enactments, including a declaration prohibiting polygamy. Although polygamy had always been rare in the Jewish community, these rabbis felt it should never be allowed. In biblical and Talmudic times, polygamy had a role to play. In those eras, emphasis was often placed on the social and economic aspect of marriage. In this context, polygamy could offer practical financial advantages. For example, in an agricultural society, a farmer needed many children to work the land and protect it against bandits. If a woman were barren or had few children, the farm could not survive. In such situations, polygamy provided security for women and enabled economic survival. However, in Rabbi Gershom's Europe, as the Jews moved away from an agrarian society, the reasons for tolerating polygamy disappeared. In addition, as poverty and deprivation intensified for the German Jewish community, people were unable to sustain multiple wives and their children. Thus, even when viewed through the lens of economics, polygamy would now cause more harm than good. Taking this into account, as well as the fact that there were always disadvantages to polygamy, such as abuse of women and familial strife, Rabbeinu Gershom chose to eliminate polygamy. Monogamy was always considered the ideal in Judaism. Rabbi Gershom's ban led the Jewish people to the marital ideal, where under the huppah, a man and a woman are reunited as 2 halves of one whole.
Okay, so that's just another example that we see of the rabbinic input. Can I get the study book through Google? Could you send it another way? Yes, I can email it to you. So, as we began saying, that throughout this course, everything that we explained and clarified in the halachic system all came with the assumption that the Torah is from Sinai, and that everything that we have is from Moshe. It's from Moshe Rabbeinu, passed down from God to the Jewish people. But is that actually the case? And could we prove that the Torah actually comes from Sinai? So let us take for a moment let us take for a moment and try to go through this in the best way possible to see if there is a way that we could actually prove that everything that we have actually took place and could be done. Here's the book. Okay, I sent you the book. You wanted the book. Let me just share. Let me share my screen. All right. All right, things are just not working out well today. Things are, just seem to be going slow. Okay. So here's the question. Do you find it important to logically prove and establish that God revealed himself to our ancestors in Sinai, and what is the reason? Do you feel that that is something that is important to know to begin with? And this is essentially really what the important question is. Do we need evidence from Sinai, and is that something very significant to know? Is there a rational basis for accepting that God revealed himself, and do I care even that that's the case? So to some people, it won't be that important. For example, to these people, if you're a complete non-believer, if you're a committed atheist, then you would find that the whole discussion is completely irrelevant. If God doesn't exist, then we're wasting our time in discussing whether God revealed himself at Sinai. That's a completely waste of discussion to begin with. So we do have to come to the assumption that at least we believe that God exists. Okay. So that's number one. Another person who this whole question may not be relevant is for the one that says, I'm not ready. What does it mean, I'm not ready? A person who finds laws and traditions in Judaism to be bothersome, meaning that you say, okay, listen, I may believe what you're saying, but ultimately I really don't want to do anything that Judaism demands. And by you proving to me that this is true, then that's going to force me to do things that I really don't want to do. I don't want to be a traditional Jew. And by you teaching me these things, you're essentially, in a way, forcing me to be a traditional Jew because you're saying that it's true and is important. So to those people, I say, don't worry about that. Don't worry about the I'm not ready. Torah does not require to immediately transform. We all know the Hanukkah menorah. We begin with one candle, and then you go to 2 candles to 3 candles. The same thing is true about everything in Judaism. You shouldn't feel that if I can't be perfect, then I can't keep Judaism at all. And this is true. The Torah says, the Torah teaches us what is the level that we should reach to, what should be our aspirations. But it doesn't necessarily mean that if we're not perfect, if we hadn't reached that point, that there's no reason to see that in any way at all as growth in that particular area. And so therefore, the fact that you say I'm not ready doesn't mean don't look at this and say, well, I'm based on everything you're going to say, I need to be a perfect Jew tomorrow. No, that's not the case. You don't need to be a perfect Jew. You have to do what you can and try to grow every day a little bit more. Then the other type of person who may not be interested in this is what we would call a major believer, a person who has passionate emunah, passionate faith. His relationship with God is entirely based on faith. You may say, I don't have to bring any rationality into the equation. I believe everything is good. But the truth is that this is very noble and this is very good way to serve God. Nevertheless, it is good to bring a little bit of a rationale explanation because that will hold the faith at times that it may be questioned. And the next person who may not be that interested in this discussion is what we call a beauty seeker. A beauty seeker are those who appreciate Judaism for its meaningfulness and its beauty, but not truth seekers. In other words, you enjoy what's nice about Judaism. For example, someone told me that they like planting. So the holiday of Sukkot, where we shake the 4 different kinds of plants, that's a wonderful holiday for them. Some people may like to eat cheesecake, so therefore the holiday of Shavuos will be a good holiday for them. but they're not necessarily seeking out the meaning of the holiday. They want just the enjoyment of Judaism. You enjoy Shabbos because you enjoy a day of rest, but not necessarily the meaningful aspects of it. And the truth is that we need to find more meaning in Judaism, and we can't just see Judaism as being something beautiful, although it is, but we also have to find something which is truly grounded in truth and in faith as well. So I think that even if you look at yourself as one of these categories, you should be able to gain somewhat to be able to grow with yourself spiritually from this, what we're going to discuss today. The vast majority of what we're going to talk today about, and the vast majority of what we discussed in this course at all, was based on the works of the Rambam or Moshe ben Maimon. And today's particular discussion is based on an epistle that comes from Yemen that was written in the last quarter of the 12th century. During that time, the Yemenite Jews were confronted with a three-pronged problem. The first issue was they had a fanatical Muslim cleric who became the ruler of the land and decreed that the Jewish subjects convert to Islam under the threat of harsh punishment and suffering. And their agony was compounded by a Jewish apostate who embraced Islam to demonstrate his zeal for the newly adapted faith. So he began preaching to the Jewish communities that Muhammad was divinely sent prophet, alluded to in the Bible, and that Islam is the new Judaism. And that brought about a revealed, but he so to speak, revealed the new Judaism that's coming through Islam. This was very difficult for the Jewish people living in Yemen. Furthermore, there was an impostor who appeared to be proclaiming himself as the Mashiach, the Messiah. And this brought more confusion to the poor, wrenched masses, where they were not able to deal with this, as it became very, very difficult. So, how do we go about it? Let's first read text number 1. Okay. And in text number 1, we will see the background of how the Rambam Maimonides deals with this. So let's read text number 1. Hope you have the book. I put it in the chat box. Remember, my co-religions, that this great, incomparable, and unique historical event is attested to by the best evidence, for never before or since has a whole nation witnessed a revelation from God or behold his splendor. So this is what the Rambam is telling them. Again, these are people who are deeply troubled and deeply having difficulty with the Jewish faith to begin with. So the Rambam says this statement, which is a very, very profound statement. It seems like a very simple one, but it's very, very profound if you think about it. He's saying that never before or since has a whole nation witnessed a revelation from God or behold his splendor. It's also a very bold statement, because we're saying that the entire Jewish people, their experience at Sinai is backed up by the greatest possible evidence. Is there actually proof that we could bring this about? Is there actually proof that we could say that every one of us had someone who was there at Mount Sinai? Each and every one of us had great grandparents who had this and taught this. So the Rambam is not the only one who said this statement. This is essentially something that we all had grandparents and great-grandparents who held firmly that Sinai event was true. Not only did they believe it, their parents and grandparents also believed it as well. This can be documented going back thousands of years, where we see that Judaism is something that was believed. It was a very strong belief. Not only that people were willing to give up their lives for this belief. We all know the lengths that the Christianity and Islam went to influence and persuade our ancestors to convert to their fold, and yet people were not willing to give up so quickly, notwithstanding the ceaseless expulsions, massacres, pogroms, and blood libels that our ancestors resisted. So all through history, people have changed beliefs when it promised to yield them wealth, power, influence, but the Jews always refused to do so. How can one possibly argue that this was all a matter of blind faith? But that's not going to be our proof, because we want to have a proof that is actually convincing evidence from Sinai. So what is the secret information that our parents and grandparents and great-grandparents used as evidence? So what we're going to do today is we're going to, quote unquote, play dumb. And we're going to assume that we don't believe anything. We're going to assume that we're not believers, and we're going to sit back and say, convince me that it's true. So when we talk about proving something, when you want to come to a conclusion of evidence of Sinai, or evidence of anything that matter, there's a number of different types of evidence. You have one type of evidence, which we'll call any measure of evidence. You can find a footprint, and that will be an evidence that someone was here. You can find fingerprints. You can find an open gate. Any sort of evidence could be anything. You have some evidence that proves that the event is more likely true than false. Then you have evidence which is beyond a reasonable doubt. Then you have evidence that meets the standards of beyond a shadow of a doubt. Now, at times when we talk about evidence of beyond a shadow of a doubt, that is pretty difficult to prove. It's, as a matter of fact, really impossible to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Right now, if someone walks in and is soaking wet, so I'll ask them, is it raining outside? And they'll tell me, yes, it's raining. Could they prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that it's raining? No. Because it could be that it's not raining anymore, even though they just walked in and they're dripping, soaking wet. To prove that something is beyond a shadow of a doubt, even if you saw it, even if you say, I was there, well, did you actually really know what you saw? They say, for example, Stalin, Yamach Shemam, was constant fear of being assassinated. So he therefore had a number of lookalikes who would appear in his place by major functions and events. So if someone says, I saw Stalin, well, maybe you didn't see Stalin, maybe you saw his lookalike. So there's always ways that you can prove, that you could disprove what someone is saying. Moreover, we're familiar with the field of philosophy, where you have things that address whether we know things exist. Does the world exist? Even if it exists, maybe we're all living in a dream, maybe we're all living in a bubble. You know, these questions that come up. There's a study they did once about a brain in a vat. And it was basically the study of how they could take someone's brain and put it in a vat and convince them that their brain is actually in their head. You know, you had people who said that it's not true that man landed on the moon, that it was a complete fabricated Hollywood event. And even though they just went again, so there's always ways that you could say beyond a shadow of a doubt is almost impossible to prove. Any measure of evidence is, of course, insufficient, and we're not going to rely on that. Other religions do rely on any measure of evidence, but we're not going to do that either, because that's obviously a lot of skepticism. That's what some people use if they are just theorists of different ways, just trying to prove something without any real evidence for it. Then you have the two in middle, which is more practical. So you have one which is more likely true than false. And if you believe that things are more likely true than false, then you are probably going to believe that. For example, it's more likely true than false that many people die of smoking, even though you can't really prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt, but you could say it's more likely true than false. We have this, what's going on over here with the killing of George Floyd. So you could say, well, you have video evidence. But even with the video evidence, there's questions. How did he really put his foot? Did he really put his knee down to actually try and push him against the pavement? Maybe his knee was not actually holding down his head. There's a lot of questions, even with the video, that are coming up. So the point over here is that you basically have two ways that a court will predominantly follow the idea of evidence. Mostly when it comes to civil cases, they'll use the second one, which is more likely true than false, where the lawyers or the plaintiff's side must show that it's more likely than not that the defendant is liable. And using numbers in order to be found, more than 50% chance that it's so. In criminal cases, they need a little bit more evidence. They have to say it's beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that the prosecutors must do more than just show it's more likely than not that a crime was committed. And they need to prove solid evidence that impresses upon the jury that there is no reasonable possibility that the defendant is innocent. So this is what we find many times, that people, even if they're criminals, they may go free because you can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. And in general, the approach that legal systems like to say, even though this may not be practiced actually by judges, but what should be the legal system is to say that it's better to let many criminals go free because you can't prove it than to lock up an innocent man. So this is what we're going to base our discussion on. Can we employ the beyond a reasonable doubt standard that the evidence of Sinai is true? You also have the clear and convincing evidence. This is not a discussion in legal. I don't know if we have any lawyers here. It's not really a legal discussion, but this is what we want to go to. What we want to focus on is this one, the beyond a reasonable doubt. So in order to do so, we need to begin with the narrative. We have to first know what our ancestors believed in order to understand why they believed it. And then we could decide if what they believed is something that we could actually believe is true. And this is one of the biggest problems, where people who are Torah deniers or Sinai deniers, they don't actually understand what it is that we believe. And there's all kinds of stories, like Moses coming down from Mount Sinai with horns on his head. Okay, that's not what we believe. We don't believe that Moses came, whatever. There's all types of stories of what exactly we believe. What we need to do is take a look at the passages in the Torah. So we have here three. We have from the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, the book of Deuteronomy. You'll see that when it comes to the book of Deuteronomy, it's different because Moses is speaking to the people. In the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, is God speaking to the people. And in the book of Deuteronomy, it's Moses speaking to the people. But regardless, let's take a look at what the narrative says. And then we'll discuss whether we believe the narrative is true. So, text number 2a. This is from Exodus. We just read this in the holiday of Shavuos last week. They say about the kid that came to school, and the teacher says to a student, he says, "David, tell me." He says, "Who broke the 2 tablets?" And David says, "I'm sorry, teacher, it wasn't me. It wasn't me." Teacher says, "Who broke the 2 tablets?" He said, "It wasn't me. I don't know. I'm sorry, teacher. I didn't know it. I'm very sorry." The teacher is furious, runs to the principal, says, "Look what's going on. This kid doesn't know who broke the 2 tablets. He doesn't know the basic tenets of Judaism. Call his dad right now. Calls his dad, gets the dad on the phone. Says, we asked your kid who broke the 2 tablets and he had no idea. Dad says, listen, you tell me how much the 2 tablets cost and I'll be happy to pay for it. So who broke the 2 tablets? Well, let's see actually what the narrative, what the story is. In the 3rd month of the children of Israel's departure from Egypt, on this day they arrived in the desert of Sinai. Okay. They journeyed from Rephidim, they arrived in the desert of Sinai, and they encamped in the desert, and Israel encamped there opposite the mountain. God said to Moses, behold, I will come to you in the thickness of the cloud in order that the people hear when I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever. So this is key number 1. God said to Moses, what does he say? He says, behold, I will come to you in the thickness of the cloud in order that what? That the people hear when I speak to you. Next, God said to Moses, go to the people and prepare them today and tomorrow, and they shall wash their garments. They shall be prepared on the 3rd day, for on the 3rd day God will descend before the eyes of all the people upon Mount Sinai. Another key line here. That God will descend before all the people upon Mount Sinai. We're soon going to explain why this is key. It came to pass on the 3rd day when it was morning, and there was thunderclaps and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountains, and a very powerful blast of a shofar, and the entire nation that was in the camp shuddered. Again, a very key point. The entire nation. Moses brought the people out towards God from the camp, and they stood at the bottom of the mountain. God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, house of bondage. All the people, again, another very key line. All the people saw the voices and the torches, the sound of the shofar, the smoking mountain. The people saw and trembled, and they stood from afar. They said to Moses, you speak with us and we will hear, but let God not speak with us, lest we die. People remained far off. Moses drew near to the opaque darkness where God was. God said to Moses, so shall you say to the children of Israel, you have seen that from the heavens I have spoken with you. Another key line. You have seen that from the heavens I have spoken with you. That is number 1. That is from the original text in the book of Exodus. Another very important line. Moses says in the book of Deuteronomy, but beware and watch for yourself at the very last you forget the things that your eyes saw, unless these things depart from your heart all the days of your life. Be sure to make them known to your children and to your children's children. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God in Horeb, when God said to me, assemble the people for me, and I will let them hear my words, and that they may learn to revere me all days that they live on earth, that they may teach their children. You approached me and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain burned with fire in the midst of the heavens with darkness, a cloud and opaque darkness. God spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of the words, but saw no image, just a voice. He told you his covenant, which he commanded you to do, 10 commandments, and he inscribed them in the 2 stone tablets. Did ever people hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard and live? You have been shown in order to know that the Lord is God. There is no one else besides him. For the heavens, he let you hear his voice to instruct you, and upon the earth he showed you his great fire. You heard his words out of the midst of the fire. So what's happening here? Moses is telling the people, he's not telling them, I told you. He's not saying, I told you such and such. I taught you such and such. He's saying, you heard every word from God. Again, in Deuteronomy, face to face, God spoke to you. At the mountain out of the midst of the fire, God spoke these words to the entire assembly of the mountain out of the midst of the fire, the cloud and the opaque darkness with great voice, which did not cease. And he inscribed them in the 2 stone tablets and gave them to me. When you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness and the mountain was burning with fire, you approached me. All the heads of your tribes and your elders, you said, behold, God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We saw this day that God speaks with man, yet man remains alive. Again, they're saying, you told it to us, Moses. So now, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. We will die if we continue to hear the voice of God. For who is there of all flesh who heard the voice of the living God speaking from amidst the fire, as we have and lived? So what do we get from all this? what we get it from all this is, from the first text, we see God is saying that he's saying, I spoke to you, to the Jewish people. He doesn't say, I spoke to Moses. He says, I spoke to you. Moses tells the people, God spoke to you. He said everything to you. You heard his voice. Now, so you understand the context here. How many people are we talking about? Well, we know the Torah tells us that the 600,000 adult males who left Egypt. The Torah says the number 600,000 males from between the age of 20 and 60. Okay, so if you take 600,000 adult males, let's assume there's 600,000 adult females. Let's assume that you have roughly 1,800,000. If you're saying 3 per family, although there are most likely more than that, 3 per family children. Okay, so you're talking at least an estimated total of 3 million people. 3 million people. So you have 3 million people who are saying that they saw the voice of God. Now, as I said before, your great-great-grandparents claimed something really unusual, that 3 million people heard God at Mount Sinai. This aside from the fact that every word in the Torah has been the same for generations and generations, not one word has ever changed. But aside from that, again, we're going to take this in a very skeptical way. We're going to, as I said, play dumb. We're going to play skepticism. We're going to play the non-believer. As sophisticated, educated people, we're going to investigate this claim on rational grounds. So let's assume that the theory is a lie. It's a mystic tale invented way back when. How did this nation of people get to believe their ancestors and their ancestors from that they had a divine revelation at Sinai? So in general, there's 2 ways that you could convince someone of something that never happened. One is called present theory, and one is called past theory. What is the difference between present theory and past theory? So present theory means as follows. Present theory says, again, this is with the assumption that everything that we just read never happened. It was made up. Coming with this assumption, you have to say as follows. Present theory, so one way to do it is as follows. You have a man named Moses. Moses came down from the mountain. Now, to be very clear, we just read, what did Moses tell the people? He didn't say, God spoke to me, and I'm telling you what God said. He said, you heard. You heard. Again, he didn't say, I heard. He said, you heard. So that means that he needs to convince 3 million people, minimum of 3 million people, that they heard something that they never actually heard. Now, assuming that he's a very talented person, he could all get them to nod and pump their fists and say, repeat, and say, yes, we just heard God's voice. We just heard God's voice. And then you need them to teach their children, and their children, and their children's children, and then you have this lie up and running. This is a present theory. The past theory is where a later point in history, someone comes along and says that this happened, whatever, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, this happened. So someone comes along, let's just call him Fred, and Fred says that you should know that there's something that happened to your ancestors, that there was a divine revelation. You say, oh, wow, I never heard about this. Well, Fred says, well, the reason you never heard about it because it was forgotten. There's a huge natural disaster that happened 10 billion years ago. And meanwhile, this is something that actually happened. Again, we're only talking about 3,000 years, even according to the narrative. And so he's reviving a lost tradition that nobody remembers except for him. He's introducing this to the people. So you might claim that the family always kept the embers of faith alive, and that he feels that the time is ripe to share it with the wider public. You may claim that it was too dark until recently, but he had a dream, he experienced it, and he saw that now is the right time to teach this. The problem with each of these is as follows. Let's begin with the present theory. With the present theory, let's share our thoughts in this. How likely or unlikely are you to believe this? Well, the problem with the present theory is, if you were to do an exercise, some of you are sitting with two people, most are sitting with one. If you were to convince someone as follows, you say, I went last year on a trip to Alaska. I'm going to say what the water looked like, what the snow looked like, what the glaciers looked like. I'm going to describe everything that I saw. Are you likely to believe my story? Yes, you're likely to believe what I told you happened to me. Now, try doing that to someone and say, do you remember last summer you came with me to Alaska? Do you remember the glaciers that we saw? Do you remember the beautiful mountains we saw? Do you remember the great time we had on the ship? Do you remember all the great hallucinations we had? Well, then he may believe you. Say, do you remember the all the cocaine that we inhaled? Then maybe he will believe you. But chances are that it's very unlikely that they're going to believe you. You could say that I did something, something happened to me, and you could try and convince that, which many times people will believe or not. If you're a good talker, you're a fast talker, you may be able to convince someone of something. You could say, I had a vision. You could say, I had a godly spiritual vision. Someone came to me in a dream. Good, that's all fine. But could you say someone came to you in a dream? Could you say something happened to you? Very, very unlikely. So if you're a really good storyteller, you're a smooth talker, a good actor, you'll be able to convince people about most claims. In fact, that's an industry that we call sales. It's about convincing people. But what's not so easy is to convince someone to believe something that you experienced, that you heard, that you saw. And that's where it's really a problem. The problem is where you're saying, not that I saw, but that you saw. If you take a look at most religions, not most, all religions, except for Judaism, as we'll soon see, they all started with this guide, so to speak, the How to Start a Religion guidebook. How does it start? One man comes to a group of people and says, I had a vision. And if it's a charismatic, good talking person, they could convince others that they saw or they spoke to God, and this is the message that God is giving over. Now, there's a very simple reason why religions start this way. Because if someone's going to convince you of something that happened to him, that's not hard to do. They can't convince you of something that happened to them because people are not going to believe it so easily. They'll say, go sell your bridge somewhere else. But now you're saying, not only am I convincing you, but I'm convincing an entire group of people that, again, not that God spoke to me. I'm convincing millions of people that God spoke to you. And this is what Moses is saying. So if you're saying the present theory is saying, if you want to say that Moses made the whole thing up and he wrote the Torah, like a lot of people want to say, Torah is man-made. Torah was given by Moses, and Moses gave us the Torah, and just like Moses is a man, so is everyone else a man, and therefore we don't have to follow it 100%. The problem is, if you read the narrative of the Torah, that's not what the Torah says. The Torah doesn't say, Moses is saying, oh, it does say many times God spoke to Moses saying, but the revelation at Sinai says God appeared to 3 million people. Not only that God appeared to Moses. It's not saying I saw, it's saying you saw. Moses is saying you saw. And so this is much more difficult to disprove. The only way present theory could work is if the Jewish people were all mentally impaired and they had hallucinations and they were on some trip, being on some poisonous mushrooms, trying to convince them of something that took place. So this is the problem. The problem is that if that's actually the case, then how do you have so many Jewish Nobel Prize winners coming out of this group? If that's where they came from. So present theory doesn't really work, and it's very difficult to convince and say that for generations that all our bubbies and zadies were all convinced by a present theory. Now the problem with the past theory. What's the shortcomings of the past theory? The past theory says that someone came along, made up a story, and says that you should know that God appeared to your ancestors at Mount Sinai 100 years ago, 1,000 years ago. He's not convincing them that you saw. He's saying this happened to people in the past. Okay, fine. He says this happened to your ancestors. Now, the first problem with past theory is that if a person approaches you and tells you about an event in history that's so enormous, again, that 3 million people saw the revelation of God, if you're saying this is completely made up, let's not call them Fred, let's say it was made up by rabbis. Some rabbis came and made up the event. So this is a very enormous, huge, massive, life-changing event. This is something that's very difficult to convince people. If you say God appeared to 10 people, God appeared to 5 people, okay, maybe. But the Torah doesn't say that. The Torah says God appeared to 3 million people. What happened to these people that are walking the earth? How come I never heard of this story before? How could it be that 3 million people had God appear to them and you're the first one coming along and saying that this happened? Even if it's 10 rabbis coming along and saying the story, they all decided together what the story would be. But still, you're saying about something that happened that we never heard about before, what happened to all these people? Did they all suddenly die? But you're saying this is my ancestors. So this is why past theory is so implausible. So as soon as Fred tells the Jews about their great-great-grandparents, what they saw on Mount Sinai with smoke, the first question is, why did they never hear about it? Let's take a look at text number 4. Imagine someone making up a story and trying to sell it. He's going to come up to a group of people, and he's going to tell them that someone in the past, their ancestors, stood at the mountain and heard God speak. He's not talking about people in China or Tibet. He's talking about the ancestors of the audience. He's claiming that God revealed himself to all their ancestors simultaneously, and by doing so founded a new religion. What is the question with which the audience will confront him? The obvious question is, if this happened to our ancestors, how is it that no one knows about it but you? What happened to the memory of the event? Everybody simply forgot it. They're more interested in the soccer scores. No one told us about it. The whole religion just disappeared. It's simply not credible to tell an entire nation that their collective ancestors witnessed such an earth-shattering event and that it was forgotten. It would be impossible to explain why the memory of the event disappeared. The person inventing the story and trying to sell it would never succeed. And so something so momentous of this kind of revelation is something that is too great for the collective amnesia. You could say something smaller happened. So for example, if you come and say, the United States became a communist dictatorship in 1919, sent free market advocates to the gulags of Arkansas, revoked the Constitution, and only reverted to a democratic form of government in 1924. Will you believe that person who says this story? You weren't alive then, so you don't know that it's not true. You don't know it's for sure not true. This is seemingly something that would still be affecting our lives today. You probably would have heard this if someone's going to make up the story, because this is something that you're saying, this is our history, this is our American history. So you're coming and saying this story, I never read it in any history books. Why don't we see this with the story of the Civil War or anything? But let's say Fred would come along and say that in Madagascar, they went communist during those years between 1919 and 1924. You have no connection to the people of Madagascar, so you would say, okay, fine. If I didn't hear about it, fine. I never really studied the history of Madagascar, so maybe true, maybe not. I don't know. So the problem is that if we're assuming that this was taught sometime in history, a guy called Fred, let's even say it was a bunch of rabbis who got together and made up this story. But again, they're convincing you and telling you, you are the Jewish people, you're the chosen people. This happened to your ancestors at Mount Sinai, a completely made up story, which is what a lot of people believe. A lot of people believe that rabbis came along and made up the story of the Torah. The problem is this exact point. You're saying I'm Jewish, and rabbis made up the story of my Jewish ancestry. Well, the problem is, if that's actually the case, then how come you didn't know about it till now? And why is it something that we don't see no historical evidence aside for these rabbis that came up with it? In other words, there's a psychological rule about people, nations, and communities when they begin to believe something. If it's a claim that people would have expected to been aware of previously, but no one else knew about it, then you would usually assume that claim to be a lie. As long as it doesn't violate the rule, which is, why did I not know about it till now? So if it's something that you did not expect to know about, then fine. But if it's something you would have been expected to know about, then that's something that one generally not believe. Now, and then, so if so, why did it happen? Why did only Fred know about it? Why didn't we hear about it from anyone else? And that would generally be the problems with the past theory, saying that something happened in the past, even though it really didn't. Of course, it's normal for groups of people to forget their collective history, especially if we went through upheavals and especially after many elapses. So if you come to Bedouins and claim that they have recovered lost knowledge about their ancestors, that they built canoes or something else, the Bedouins would say, okay, I never knew about that point, but that's fine. Or if you're going to come to the Jewish people and say, by the way, 3,000 years ago, your ancestors actually liked eating chocolate. Okay, fine. That's a small detail. That's not an entire historical story that's based on that. So even if Fred is a very good convincer, but to say that this earth-shattering divine revelation, that all the people, 3 million people saw this, and you're the first person that's coming along and telling us this story. Again, assuming that it's made up, even if it's a bunch of rabbis who made it up, why did we never hear this before to the people that they're telling it to? There's another problem with past theory, and that is as follows. Have you ever heard of these individuals? Who are some Jewish personalities? Who are some Jewish personalities that you know? You may know Moses, David, Solomon. Right? What are some other Jewish personalities that you know? Baal Shem Tov. You may know Joshua. The problem is, where is Fred? Right? Where is Fred? Where is the guy that taught us the story? You want to say it's rabbis. We'll call them Rabbi Moshe Kalman, Rabbi Zalman Schneer, and Rabbi Chaim Moshe. These were the rabbis that made up the story. Where are these rabbis who told us the story to begin with? They're nowhere found in Jewish history. Let's read text number 5. The major problem with the theory is we've never heard of Fred or his heroic resurrection of Judaism. Certainly one of the most significant events in Jewish history would have been the fumble when world Jewry forgot that there were 3 million prophets, and the recovery when Fred reminded the Jews about the national prophecy at Mount Sinai. Yet in the otherwise comprehensive Jewish history, we find no mention of such claim. Jewish texts describe myriad historical crises and the heroes who assisted during these difficult times. We know that Moses brought the Torah down from Mount Sinai. Joshua first brought the Jews into the land of Israel. David slew Goliath. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. And Ezra brought the Jews back to the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile. We know that Rabbi Judah the Prince compiled the Mishnah, and that Ravina and Ravashi compiled the Talmud. We know about Maimonides, Nachmanides, and hundreds of other stars of the medieval Jewry and what their respective contributions were. We possess detailed records about every great Jewish personality except for one. We don't have any mention of the man who reminded Jewry that they were the only ones, that they were the only human people in human history ever to experience national prophecy. We don't have any record of the amnesia Fred rescued from them. Until 200 years ago, every Jew and member of Jewish breakaway groups like the Christians, Sadducees, Karaites affirmed ancient Jewry, their direct ancestors had experienced national prophecy at Mount Sinai. Not a single ancient or contemporary individual or religious community has any tradition about the man who should have been the second greatest hero of Jewish history, the man we're calling Fred. Why? Okay. So this, of course, would claim that, and you say, okay, well, fine. The man's name wasn't Fred. It was really King David. He was the one. Or it was really Ezra. He was the one. Or Joshua was the one that convinced them. So if they were the ones who reminded them about the great mass revelation at Mount Sinai, should have been recorded. Most important undertaking in legacy. Again, this is assumption of past theory, not the Moses theory. The present theory we discussed about Moses convincing them. That someone else later will convince them, then we have King David conquering the territory. We have books from King David. We have Book of Psalms from King David. Well, we don't find any writing about anything of this. It's all with the assumption that that we know and accepted that it happened, not that he's convincing anyone of something that happened in the past that they don't believe. There is another theory, just so that we cover all our grounds. There's another theory called the snowball theory. The snowball theory is as follows. The snowball theory says that Moses came to the Jews way back then and said to them that he or perhaps a few other people saw God appear in the mountain, and he gave them, only them, the Torah. Because the Jews were so impressionable under the influence of Moses' charisma, they believed him. Which this is essentially what some people believe is the actual story. Okay, they believed him. It's not a claim of mass revelation, like we said, that the Torah actually says. In these scenarios, there's a few people who witness God. And as we know, this is a lie that could be told. In fact, every religion and mythology begins this way. That you have a few people, what we would call the rabbis, in our case, who came along and gave the story. Then somewhere along the line, it snowballed. Over thousands of years, the lie grew in huge myth, and it turned into a huge myth of mass revelation. Every time the story was retold, for example, on Passover, new details were added, including the most important detail that the people witnessed the revelation. Only then was the Torah written down, and that's how the lie came about. Okay? So again, this is what some people believe. The problem with this theory is the story changing from me to all of us is an extraordinary jump. And is it really possible? We see that there are no other religions that use this kind of snowball theory because of this problem. Let's go through it in text 6a. The beginning of all ancient and modern religions have a common thread. One or two people have a revelation and persuade others to follow. Thus, for example, Buddhist writings tell us that Prince Siddhartha Gautama launched Buddhism after his solitary ascendance through the 8 stages of transic insight. Islamic texts tell us that Muhammad founded Islam following the first of many personal prophetic experiences. Christian writings reveal that Paul first met Jesus, converted to Christianity, and spread the faith more than 3 decades after Jesus' death. Joseph Smith Jr. and his partner Oliver Cowdery launched the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, after the two men were visited by angels and long-dead disciples of Jesus. The Sun Myung Moon launched the Unification Church after privately receiving direct order to do so from Jesus himself. The beginnings of Children of God, Christian Science, Eknaker, Alan Vittel, I Am, the theophys, whatever. In fact, the beginnings of all world religions are equally unverifiable. Okay? Never does a large, clearly identifiable group of people experience prophecy and live to tell others about it. Moreover, in a handful of cases where large groups of people supposedly witness miracles, rarely are these witnesses named or identified in any way that would allow for verification, and the very exceptional cases involving clearly identified groups of witnesses, never more than one or two of the religion's current adherents claim to have met or descended directly from the named witnesses. In all these cases, the religion's credibility rests on the credibility of its one or two founders. While it's certainly possible that the beginnings claimed by any of the thousands of sects and cults included in the world's more than 300 major religious traditions could be true, it is easy to imagine how charismatic charlatans could have launched any of these movements. The one known exception to the rule is Judaism. Some Indian groups have possessed an oral tradition that the Hindu god Krishna addressed the millions of warriors who participated in the battle described in the Bhagavad Gita, a basic Hindu text. This is not a challenge to our observation. However, since some oral tradition also reports that those who heard Krishna speak died in the battle. No witness survived to testify to its experience, and the story of this mass prophecy is only known because the god revealed it to an unnamed individual later in history. So, again, the point over here is not to elevate Judaism's claim over other faiths. Everyone's allowed to believe whatever they want. We're trying to bring here the Jewish belief. There is no other religion who even tries the snowball theory, which is that there was one person, and then eventually it was written down at the story changed and they're revealed to many people, because that's very, very difficult to sell. And as a matter of fact, it's impossible to sell that you have ancestors who something happened to them that never actually happened to 3 million people. It's interesting to note that the Rambam asks, why did God allow all these religions to come about if if they bring about such difficulty and such challenges for the Jewish people? And he says it actually paves the way for Mashiach, because now the entire world believes in Mashiach in a certain sense. The entire world believes that there is some sort of redeemer to come along and to be the savior of the people, even though they don't believe, obviously, in the Jewish Messiah. But the concept of Mashiach they do believe in, and that's actually what the Rambam says, the reason that when the true Messianic king will arise and prove to be successful, his position becoming exalted and uplifted, they will all return and realize that their ancestors endowed them to false heritage, and their prophets and ancestors called them to earth. Another point, which is not really discussed here, that even all the other religions, even Christianity and Islam, which are the two largest religions, they believe that the revelation at Sinai happened. They just say that things change down the line. So, does this point that Judaism, religion, to make a claim or mass revelation get us there? So I believe it does. Say a guy comes over to you with a chunk of gold in his hand, and he tells you that he just took a piece of cow manure and turned it into gold. You examine it, test it, put it under a microscope, and determine that it's real. It's a 14-karat gold. What is the first thing you're going to ask the guy? Can you replicate your results? Show me how you did it. Right? The rule of physics, anything that can occur in natural way has to happen more than once. Social science identifies trends in human behavior. They're observable in societies as well. Something that occurs naturally on a social level is expected to happen repeatedly. This applies to world events as well. Just like what we see is going on now today with the protesting in the streets, we already know happened in the 60s, the same thing. So things happen again. The problem is this story is one which no one ever claimed happened to them again in any way. Text 7. A basic assumption of scientific method is the results are replicable. If something happens naturally once, we expect it'll happen more than once. Although history is not science, everyone knows that history repeats itself. Not in every last detail, but at least in general. thousands of religions have existed in the world, nobody has documented a single one that has the same claim as Judaism. If the story evolved naturally or is perpetuated as a hoax, why has it not happened more than once? And since it hasn't, is it irrational to believe in Sinai? Who is relying on blind faith? The one who believes in the story as written, or the one who claims without any historical support that it was a result of natural processes, but only happened one time to one group in all of recorded history? And this simple objection will apply to any natural explanation that anyone will ever propose to discredit the authenticity of Sinai revelation. If it is natural, then why did it happen only once in recorded history? And Moses said it's only going to happen once. So many religions have started throughout history, and they all experience in the same way. Why did not any of them claim to have a mass revelation like Judaism? Shouldn't a phenomenon repeat itself through history? If Judaism is such a powerful religion, it's been around for so long, every culture should have tried this. Yet we see in every area, science, medicine, architecture, the arts, religion, some of the most famous religions borrowed from Judaism. If such a thing was possible for a minor event, a claim of divine revelation to an individual to expand into a mass revelation is so easy, then it should have been something that happened to other religions too. Considering the mass revelation, maybe it's something that happened to other religions. Why is it only possible to say that this is something that was made up in Judaism? Fundamental believers are very passionate about their faith, and they could have easily embellished their claim, just like people say about Judaism. It was a bunch of rabbis who made it up, and here it is. Well, why couldn't anyone else do that? Even the snowball theory, the past period theory, the present theory, it could have seemingly been very easily made up. And the answer is it couldn't have, because you can't make up such a story. It is impossible to make up such a story using any of the theories which we're assuming are made up, saying that God appeared to 3 million people. Text number 8 from Deuteronomy. Moses tells the Jewish people, "For ask now regarding the early days that were before you, since that day that God created man upon the earth, and from one end of the heavens to the other end of heavens, whether there is anything like this thing, whether there's anything like this great thing, or was the likes of it heard? Did ever a people hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire, as you have heard, and live?" Moses tells the people, did anyone ever hear God's voice speaking out of the fire and live? And this happened to you, says Moses. Could Moses be convincing them that they heard something that they never actually heard? And the answer is no, that would be impossible. And by the way, that's only happened once. Even when the coming of Mashiach, we're not going to have this revelation. It was a one time in history, this revelation. Text number 9. The divine revelation of Mount Sinai was a fact witnessed by millions of people, all of whom reported it to its minutest detail accurately. For the whole people of Israel stood at Mount Sinai and witnessed it. We know that this is a fact because millions of Jews in our day accept it as such, because they received it as such from their own parents. And these millions, in turn, received the evidence from the previous generation, and so on, in an uninterrupted chain of transmitted evidence from millions to millions of witnesses, generation after generation, back to the original millions of witnesses who saw the event with their own eyes. Among the original witnesses, there were many who were initiated in the sciences of those days. For example, Egypt, many achievements of which were being baffling nowadays. Among them were philosophers and thinkers, as well as the ignorant and uneducated persons, women and children of all ages. Yet, all of them reported the event and phenomena connected with it without contradicting to one another. Such a fact is certainly indisputable. I do not believe that there is another fact which can match it for evidence and accuracy. To deny such a fact is anything but scientific. It is the very opposite of science. Parenthetically, it is unfortunate that this basic difference between the Jewish religion and those of others is so little known, for the Jewish religion is the only one that is not based on a single founder or a few, but is based on the divine revelation witnessed by all the people, numbering several millions. This answers also such a statement. The acceptance of the Torah as being the only truth is dangerous, since its authors were only men, and as men they could have been infallible. Jews accept the Torah precisely not because it was given by men, but because it was given by God, not by man. And it was given in the presence of millions of people who had seen it and heard it with their own eyes and ears. That is why the Torah is the absolute truth, and for God is absolute. Ultimately, however, we find ourselves struggling with this idea. We probably need to delve a little bit more in Jewish text and to understand and appreciate what the Torah is and what the Torah says. And we'll find more meaning. We'll find more meaning if we want to allow ourselves to see the Torah in that way. And so here we are. We've brought about the scientific proof that the Torah is true. I'm going to share a little video with you as well. One second. Let me get it open first. One second. Let me share. Where's my video? I can't find it. Oh, here it is. Okay.
6. 1. For thousands of years, our people have believed that God revealed himself to our ancestors and addressed them at Mount Sinai. 2. It is unlikely that someone could falsely convince an entire nation that they themselves experienced a divine revelation. 3. It is unlikely that someone could falsely persuade an entire nation that all their ancestors experienced a divine revelation. The listeners would have refused to accept this, asserting that if it were true, they certainly would have heard of this from their parents. 4. If someone single-handedly reminded the Jewish people of the Sinai event, this person would be duly recognized in the record of Jewish history. 5. The fact that no other religious group lays claim to a mass revelation highlights the uniqueness of the Jewish faith. 6. It is unlikely that the Sinai narrative began as a story of a revelation to a few that snowballed into a story of mass revelation. If this were a possibility, it would have been replicated by others.
All right. Anyone have any questions?